Welcome to Sleepy Love Tales, soothing romantic stories to help you relax and fall asleep. Let us know where you're listening from in the comments. If soft, heartfelt tales help you unwind, be sure to subscribe so you never miss a moment of calm. Now, let's begin tonight's story. The Last Bell of Autumn. Blackwood Academy was less a school and more a mausoleum of ambition. It stood sentinel on a hill in New England, a collection of Gothic stone buildings that clawed at the perpetually grey sky. Its grounds a carefully curated wilderness of ancient oaks and whispering pines. The air, crisp and sharp, carried the mingled scents of wood smoke from the town below and the damp, sweet decay of fallen leaves. It was a place of gilded melancholy, where the rustle of turning pages in the cavernous library and the distant mournful chime of the bell tower were the only true measures of time's relentless passage. The world outside the iron gates, a world of noise and chaos and messy, unpredictable life, was a distant rumour, a place one read about in leather-bound books but never truly inhabited. Nathaniel Croft, scion of the Croft dynasty, moved through this hallowed space with the effortless grace of a man who knew he belonged, yet felt no particular attachment to it. He was a ghost in his own life, a spectator to his own carefully orchestrated future. His intelligence was a blade he kept sheathed, his wit a shield, his detachment a fortress. He existed in a state of perpetual, cynical observation, a habit born of a childhood spent in sprawling empty houses, where love was a transaction and affection a commodity to be dispensed in carefully measured doses. His father, a man who measured the world in quarterly reports and stock prices, had a life mapped out for Nathaniel that was as predictable as the changing of the seasons. Blackwood, then Oxford, then a seat on the board of Croft Industries. It was a future of immense privilege and profound emptiness, and Nathaniel, in his quiet, simmering rebellion, yearned to disrupt it, to throw a wrench in the works of the great grinding machine of his destiny. His act of defiance when it came was not a grand gesture, but a small, cynical act of sabotage. A philosophy essay, a meaningless exercise in intellectual posturing became his weapon. He didn't plagiarize for a grade, he had no need for such pedestrian validation, but to prove a point, to demonstrate the utter indifference of the system he was a part of. He lifted a passage from a relatively obscure dissertation, a piece of academic arcana he was sure no one at Blackwood had ever read, and wove it seamlessly into his own elegant, empty prose. It was a perfect crime, a silent stream into the void. He was, of course, caught. The headmaster, a man with the weary eyes of a zookeeper who has seen every trick the animals can perform, did not summon Nathaniel's father. That would have been an inconvenience, a disruption to the delicate ecosystem of alumni donations and societal expectations. Instead, he chose a punishment that was, in its own way, far more insidious. "Expulsion is too easy, Nathaniel," the headmaster said, his voice a dry rustle of paper. "It's what you want, isn't it? A grand exit, a dramatic severing of ties. No, I think we need something a bit more restorative. You will join the drama department's autumn production of Cyrano de Bergerac." Nathaniel felt a cold, hard knot of dread tighten in his stomach. The theatre, a place of earnest, messy emotion, of overwrought sentiment and performative vulnerability. He despised it. "Perhaps, Nathaniel," the headmaster continued, a faint, ironic smile playing on his lips, "learning to pretend to be someone else will teach you something about being yourself." And so Nathaniel found himself pushing open the heavy oak doors of the theatre, a place he had avoided for his entire tenure at Blackwood. The air inside was thick with the scent of old scripts, a heady mixture of paper, dust and dried glue, and the faint, lingering aroma of sweat and stage paint. A single bare bulb on a stand, the ghost light, cast long dancing shadows across the empty stage. a solitary sentinel in the darkness. It was in this dusty, hallowed space that he first saw her. Abigail Hayes. She was standing centre stage, bathed in the soft glow of the ghost light, rehearsing a monologue. She was all fire and light, her voice a clarion call that seemed to warm the cavernous empty space. Her gestures were fluid and expressive, her body a conduit for the raw, untamed emotion of the words she spoke. She was the antithesis of everything he was, passion to his restraint, light to his shadow. When she finished, she turned, and her eyes, the colour of warm honey, met his. They were eyes that seemed to see right through his carefully constructed facade, to the hollow space within. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice still ringing with the echoes of her performance. "I'm here for the play," he said, his own voice sounding thin and reedy in the vastness of the theatre. A flicker of amusement danced in her eyes. "Are you? I didn't take you for the theatrical type." "I'm not," he said, a touch of his usual irony returning to him. "I'm a prisoner of war." She laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a summer breeze. "Well, welcome to the front lines. What's your name, prisoner?" "Nathaniel Croft." "Abigail Hayes," she said, extending a hand. Her grip was firm, her palm warm. "I'm playing Roxane." He was, to his eternal mortification, cast as Christian, the handsome but artless suitor, a role he found insultingly simple, a two-dimensional caricature of a man. He was to be the face, the beautiful, empty vessel for another man's words, another man's soul. During their first rehearsal together, his delivery was flat, his movements stiff. He read the lines with a cool detachment that bordered on contempt. Abigail, ever the professional, tried to guide him, to coax some semblance of feeling from him. "The lines are just the map, Mr. Croft," she said, her patience already wearing thin. "The feeling is the territory. Are you planning on visiting or just looking at it from the border?" He had no answer for her. He had spent his entire life learning that feeling was a liability, a port from which one must always be ready to sail. And as he stood there on that dusty stage, under the watchful eye of the ghost light, he felt a strange, unfamiliar tremor in the foundations of his carefully constructed world. It was the first tolling of a bell he had never heard before, a sound that was both a warning and an invitation. The days shortened, the leaves turned from crimson to gold, and the air grew colder, carrying the promise of the coming winter. Nathaniel's punishment became a strange sort of purgatory, a sentence he served in the hidden, forgotten corners of the academy, the echoing empty theatre late at night, the secluded bench in the memorial garden where the leaves fell like silent tears, the hushed upper stacks of the library where the air was thick with the scent of old books and forgotten stories. These became his sanctuary, his confessional, his classroom. He began to stay late, long after the director had called an end to rehearsals, drawn by a force he couldn't quite name. It was Abigail, of course. She was always there, a solitary figure on the dimly lit stage, her passion, a beacon in the encroaching darkness. She would run her lines, her voice filling the empty space, and he would watch from the shadows, a silent, unseen audience. One night he found the courage to step out of the darkness and onto the stage. "You're going to wear yourself out," he said, his voice softer than he intended. She turned, startled, a hand flying to her chest. "You scared me." "Sorry," he said, and he meant it. "It's fine," she said, her voice a little breathless. I need to get this right." "It's already right," he said. "It's more than right. It's perfect." A faint blush crept up her neck. Perfection is a myth. There's always room for improvement. And so their stolen rehearsals began. Away from the critical eyes of the director and the rest of the cast, they ran their scenes together, over and over again. She coached him, her patience a stark contrast to her initial frustration. She tried to coax real emotion from his guarded delivery, to teach him the language of the heart, a language he had never learned to speak. "You're not just saying the words, Nathaniel," she would say, her hand on his arm, her touch sending a jolt of warmth through him. "You're feeling them. They're your words. They're coming from a place deep inside you, a place you've kept locked away." During one of these late-night sessions, as she was in the middle of a particularly emotional speech, she faltered. Her breath caught in her throat and a tremor ran through her hand. She dismissed it with a wave of her hand, a forced smile on her face. "Just tired," she said, her voice a little shaky. "Long day." But he saw the flicker of fear in her eyes, a fleeting glimpse of a vulnerability she kept hidden beneath her vibrant facade. It was the first crack in her armour, and it intrigued him more than her strength. It made her real, human, fragile. Their scripts became a silent conversation, a secret correspondence that unfolded in the margins of the printed text. He would leave a cynical comment, a barbed observation, and she would reply with a challenging question, a gentle prodding. Soon the notes became more personal, fragments of their lives shared in the quiet intimacy of the late-night hours. He wrote of his lonely childhood, of the cavernous, empty houses and the ghost of a father who was never there. She wrote of her dreams of the stage, of the burning desire to live 1,000 lives, to feel 1,000 emotions. "Is it easier to love a soul you've never seen?" he wrote one night, his pen scratching in the silence of the empty theatre. The next day her reply was waiting for him. "Is it easier to show your soul when you think no one is looking?" One evening, as they were rehearsing Roxane's speech of love, something shifted. She stood before him, her eyes shining in the dim light, and delivered the lines with a raw, heartbreaking sincerity that transcended the text. For the first time he didn't hear the character. He heard her. He felt the weight of her words, the depth of her feeling, and it was as if a hand had reached into his chest and squeezed his heart. He felt an unfamiliar ache, a yearning he couldn't name, a desperate desire to be worthy of such profound, unselfish love. In the quiet of the stage, with only the ghost light for an audience, her voice filled all the empty spaces inside him he hadn't known were there. He was a ship that had been sailing on a vast empty ocean, and she was the first sight of land, the promise of a safe harbour. And as he looked at her, at this girl who was all fire and light and life, he felt a terrifying, exhilarating thought take root in his heart. He was falling in love with her. The world, which had seemed to shrink to the size of the small, intimate space between them, came crashing back in with a brutal, unforgiving force. The golden warmth of autumn gave way to the stark, cold beauty of late fall, the trees shedding their fiery leaves like a final, desperate act of defiance before the long, silent sleep of winter. The air grew sharp and thin, and the sky seemed to hang low and heavy over the stone buildings of Blackwood. The shift in the season mirrored the change in their own small world. The quiet intimacy of their late-night rehearsals was replaced by the bright, harsh glare of the stage lights, the critical eyes of the director, the rustling of scripts in the hands of the full cast. The magic of their stolen moments seemed to dissipate in the cold, clear light of day. The collapse came during a full-cast rehearsal, a week before the play was set to open. Abigail was in the middle of a scene, her voice soaring to the rafters, her body alive with the passion of her character. And then, in an instant, the light in her seemed to flicker and die. She stumbled, her hand flying to her head, a look of confusion and fear on her face, and then she crumpled to the floor, a small, fragile heap in the centre of the vast, empty stage. The world seemed to stop. The director's shouts, the gasps of the cast, the frantic scramble to her side. It all seemed to happen in slow motion, a dream from which Nathaniel couldn't wake. He stood frozen in the wings, a cold, sickening dread coiling in his stomach. The illusion of her wellness, the vibrant facade she had so carefully constructed, had shattered for everyone to see. He waited outside the infirmary, the sharp, clean scent of antiseptic burning his nostrils, the rhythmic beeping of a machine, a maddening counterpoint to the frantic beating of his own heart. Her parents, a handsome, silver-haired couple with the same warm, honey-coloured eyes as their daughter, arrived in a flurry of hushed whispers and worried glances. It was from them that he learned the truth, a truth that was far more devastating than he could have ever imagined. Abigail had a progressive neuromuscular disease, a cruel, relentless thief that was slowly, inexorably stealing her life from her. Her time wasn't just fleeting, it was being actively, brutally taken. The play, he realised with a sickening lurch, was not a stepping stone to a career, a bright future on the stages of New York or London. It was her last great act of defiance, her final desperate attempt to burn as brightly as she could before the darkness consumed her. As he reeled from this revelation, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was his father. The conversation was clipped, transactional, a series of commands disguised as questions. Oxford applications, a scheduled flight to London for Christmas. The real world, his father's voice, a cold metallic drone in his ear, awaited. "Don't get distracted by temporary things," his father said. And the words, which had once been a comforting reminder of his own detachment, now felt like a death sentence. He was a coward. The thought, sharp and clear, pierced through the fog of his shock and grief. He was a coward, and he was afraid. Not of her illness, not of the pain and the suffering that lay ahead, but of the love he felt for her, a love that was now inextricably intertwined with the certainty of loss. He was afraid of the immense, all-consuming pain of losing her, a pain he knew would shatter him, leave him broken and adrift in a world without her light. He retreated, his aloofness returning like a shield, his cynicism a suit of armour. He avoided the infirmary, the sight of her fragile body in that sterile white bed more than he could bear. He missed a rehearsal, the thought of standing on that stage, in that space that had been theirs, a torment. He saw her fragility not as something to be cherished, a precious, fleeting gift, but as a future of pain he was not equipped to handle. She was a burning star, and he was a coward, already calculating the distance to save himself from the inevitable darkness that would follow her light. He was his father's son, after all, a man who knew how to cut his losses, how to walk away from a bad investment. And Abigail, with her fierce, beautiful, dying light, was the worst investment of all. The storm that had been brewing on the horizon for days finally broke, unleashing its fury on the unsuspecting world. The wind howled like a wounded animal, rattling the old mullioned windows of the theatre, and the rain came down in sheets, a relentless, percussive drumming on the slate roof. It was a night for ghosts and secrets, for confessions and reckonings. The headmaster, his face a mask of weary resignation, had delivered the final blow. Abigail would not be allowed to perform. It was too risky, he said. Her health was too fragile. The words, delivered with a gentle, paternalistic finality, were a death sentence. Her last dream, the one thing that had kept her fighting, had been taken from her. Nathaniel, hearing the news, felt a surge of a rage so fierce it stole his breath. He found her where he knew she would be, on the empty stage, a solitary figure in the dim glow of the ghostlight. She wasn't crying. Her grief was too raw, too deep for tears. It was a cold, hard knot of rage in her chest, a fire that burned in her eyes. "So, you came to see the tragic heroine in her final act," she said, her voice a low, dangerous hiss. "Come to offer your condolences, your pity." "Abigail, he began, but she cut him off, her voice rising with each word. "Don't you dare," she said, her voice trembling with a fury that was both terrifying and magnificent. Don't you dare look at me with pity. I've had enough of that to last a lifetime. I wanted a scene partner, not an audience to my tragedy." She turned on him then, her eyes blazing, and the words poured out of her, a torrent of pain and anger and love. She accused him of being a ghost long before he met her, of being too afraid to live a single moment with genuine feeling. She accused him of being a coward, a man who ran from the first sign of trouble, the first hint of real, messy, unpredictable life. Her words struck home, each one a hammer blow against the crumbling walls of his defences. He had no answer for her, no witty retort, no cynical observation. There was only the truth, raw and ugly and undeniable. He broke, the carefully constructed facade of the man who didn't care, the man who was above it all, shattered into a million pieces. He confessed his fear, his voice a choked whisper in the vast empty space. Not of her illness, he told her, his words tumbling out in a rush of desperate, belated honesty, but of his love for her, of the immense, all-consuming pain of losing her. He admitted that she was the first real thing in his transient, meaningless life, the first person who had ever made him feel anything at all. The performance, the one he had been giving his entire life, fell away, leaving only two terrified, vulnerable people, stripped bare in the harsh, unforgiving light of the truth. The argument dissolved into a shuddering silence, the space between them humming with the unspoken words, the raw, aching need. He stepped toward her, his movements hesitant, his body a question. He didn't touch her at first, just stood before her, his eyes pleading with her to see the utter, complete surrender in them. When she gave a small broken sob, a sound that tore through him like a physical blow, he gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were both infinitely precious and the only thing anchoring him to the world. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of her, the sweet, clean fragrance of soap and rain and something that was uniquely, indefinably her. He kissed her then, and it was a kiss of profound, desperate tenderness. It wasn't about seduction or passion or desire, but about affirmation, about a silent, solemn vow to stay, to fight, to love for however long they had. His mouth was warm and soft on hers, a stark contrast to the cold fear that had gripped them both. He kissed her, like he was breathing her in, trying to memorize the very essence of her, the taste of her skin, the feel of her lips against his. His hands traced the line of her back, feeling the fragile strength there, the delicate bones beneath the soft fabric of her sweater. He drew shivers from her that were not from the cold, but from a need that was as deep and as vast as his own. When their bodies pressed together, it was terror and fragility all at once, a dance of need and tenderness, where every sigh, every gasp, every trembling breath seemed to carry a lifetime of longing and a promise to face the storm together, for however long they had. The world outside raged, the wind and the rain a symphony of chaos and destruction, but in the small sacred space of the empty stage, illuminated by the single steady glow of the ghost light, they found a quiet, fragile peace, a shelter from the storm. The night of the play's premiere arrived, a night of bittersweet poignancy, of endings and beginnings. The air was thick with the scent of nervous energy and hairspray, the backstage area a flurry of activity, a controlled chaos of actors in various states of dress and undress, of stagehands barking orders, of the low expectant murmur of the audience settling into their seats. But for Nathaniel and Abigail, the world had once again shrunk, this time to the quiet intimacy of her dressing room, a small cluttered space that had become their sanctuary. Nathaniel had made a choice. The airline ticket to London, a symbol of his old life, of his carefully orchestrated future, lay torn in half in the bottom of a wastebasket. He had called his father, his voice steady and clear, and informed him that he would not be flying to London for the holidays. He was staying. He was not running, not anymore. He had used his family's resources. the privilege he had once so despised, not to escape but to create. He had arranged with the theatre tech to have the stage for 1 hour before the official show, a single stolen hour in the eye of the storm. He led Abigail, her hand in his, to the empty theatre. The stage was not lit with the harsh, unforgiving glare of the spotlights, but with a soft, warm glow, a single, perfect circle of light in the centre of the vast, empty space. He had filled the wings with her favourite flowers, late blooming autumn roses, their scent a sweet, fragrant promise in the dusty air. For an audience of one another, they performed their final scene from Cyrano, the balcony scene where love is confessed purely, through words, through soul. They didn't need the costumes, the props, the artifice of the stage. They were not Christian or Cyrano or Roxane. They were just Nathaniel and Abigail, and the words, which had once been a map to a territory he was afraid to visit, were now the truest expression of his heart. When they finished, the silence that followed was not empty, but full, resonant with the depth of their shared emotion. As the final bell of autumn tolled across the campus, a sound that was no longer mournful but a gentle, poignant reminder of the preciousness of time, they sat on the edge of the stage, their legs dangling into the darkness of the orchestra pit. He told her then, his voice a low, steady murmur in the quiet of the empty theatre, that he had deferred his acceptance to Oxford for a year. He wasn't running. He was staying. For her, for them, for whatever time they had left. Back in the quiet of the dressing room, the sounds of the official play beginning were a distant murmur, a world away. They were exhausted, emotionally bare, their hearts laid open. There was no need for grand passion now, for desperate clinging kisses. There was only a profound, resonant closeness, a quiet intimacy that was more powerful than any performance. He took her hand, his thumb stroking her palm, and brought it to his lips, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to her knuckles. He read to her from a book of poetry they both loved, his voice a low, steady anchor in the quiet room, a gentle melody against the distant, muffled sounds of the play. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her breathing evening out, her body relaxing into his. The intimacy was in the shared silence, the complete lack of pretense, the simple, profound comfort of being together. He pressed a soft, lingering kiss to her temple, a promise not of forever, but of now, of this moment, this breath, this heartbeat. It was a connection that was absolute, a quiet bloom of love in the face of an encroaching winter. As he looked at her, at the way the dim light of the dressing room softened the lines of her face, at the gentle rise and fall of her chest, he knew that a life was not measured in the number of its seasons, but in the one autumn that truly matters, the one that teaches us to love against the falling of the leaves. The last autumn leaf caught by the wind tapped against the dressing room window, a gentle, insistent reminder of the beauty and the fragility of it all. And for the first time in his life, Nathaniel Croft was not afraid. He was home. The Solitude of Winter. The world had been bleached of colour, leaving only the stark monochrome of snow and shadow. In the deep, hushed forests of the Pacific Northwest in the early winter of 1805, the silence was a living thing. It was a profound, ancient quiet, broken only by the sibilant whispers of the wind as it wound its way through the stoic, snow-laden firs. It was a silence Henry Wren had actively sought, a silence he had cultivated for a decade as a shield against the cacophony of a world he had long since abandoned. But on this day the silence was broken. A thin, improbable plume of smoke, a stark grey finger against the bruised lavender of the twilight sky, drew his eye. It was a smudge on the otherwise untouched canvas of the winter landscape. His first thought was of a rival trapper, a trespasser on his self-proclaimed territory, or perhaps an indigenous encampment, though he had seen no signs of the local tribes for months. Caution, a finely honed instinct that had kept him alive in this unforgiving wilderness, took hold. He tethered his snowshoes, his movements economical and silent, and began to move toward the smoke, his rifle held loosely in his hand. He found it nestled in a small sheltered clearing, a cabin, small and moss-covered, looking as though it had sprouted from the very earth itself. It was a fragile sanctuary against the vast, indifferent wilderness. The smoke rose from a crudely fashioned stone chimney, a brave defiance against the encroaching cold. He circled the cabin once, his eyes scanning for any sign of threat. He saw none, only the small, well-tended structure, a testament to someone's desperate will to survive. He approached the door, his moccasins making no sound on the packed snow, and knocked. The door creaked open a hand's breadth, and a pair of eyes, startlingly blue in a pale, thin face, peered out at him. It was a woman. She was young, perhaps in her mid-20s, though her eyes held a sorrow that seemed to age her beyond her years. She was wary, almost wild, like a cornered animal, but there was a fire in her gaze, a fierce, untamed flicker that he had not expected. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice a low, husky whisper, as if she had not used it in some time. "Henry Wren," he said, his voice a gravelly rumble from disuse. "I saw your smoke." She opened the door a little wider, revealing a small, sparsely furnished interior. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, inviting glow on the rough-hewn walls. A faded, leather-bound journal lay open on a small table, its pages filled with intricate sketches of flora and fragmented, elegant script. She clutched the journal to her chest as if it were a shield. "I am Honora Quinn," she said, her chin lifting with a defiant tilt that seemed at odds with her fragile appearance. He had heard whispers at the distant Hudson's Bay Company outpost of a lost missionary expedition, a fool's errand into this untamed land. He had dismissed it as another tale of civilized arrogance meeting a wild, unforgiving end. But here was a survivor, a ghost from that forgotten story. He was a man accustomed to solitude, a man who had sought the silent company of the pines, and now he was another soul to tend to, a complication he had not sought. The outpost had tasked him, should he find any survivors, to escort them back to civilization, a task he now grudgingly accepted. "You're a long way from home, Miss Quinn," he said, his tone gruff. "The snows are deep, but once they clear, I'll see you back to the outpost." "I'm not leaving," she said, her voice gaining a surprising strength. "Not yet." "This is no place for a woman alone," he said, his gaze sweeping over her thin frame, the dark circles under her eyes. "I am not alone," she said, her eyes flashing. "I have the dead to tend to." Her voice broke on the last word, and for a moment the fire in her eyes was extinguished, replaced by a profound, bottomless grief. "I will not leave until the earth claims what is hers, and I comprehend why this earth spared me and took all others." She told him then of the illness that had swept through her expedition, taking her family, her colleagues, one by one. She spoke of a gentle, silent tribe who had found her, nursed her back from the brink of death, and then, as mysteriously as they had appeared, vanished. He found himself listening against his will to her story. He saw the stubborn set of her jaw, the unwavering resolve in her eyes, and he knew he could not force her to leave. Not yet. Another soul to tend to, he thought, a familiar weariness settling in his bones. When all I sought was the silent company of the pines, yet there is a strange fire in her eyes, even amid such desolation. As if to punctuate her defiance, the wind began to howl, a low, mournful cry that rose to a furious shriek. The sky, already dark, grew blacker still. Snow began to fall, thick and fast, obscuring the world outside the small cabin in a swirling vortex of white. A blizzard, sudden and ferocious, descended upon them, trapping them in the small lodge. An uneasy truce was declared, not by words, but by the shared, unspoken understanding that for now they were bound together by the storm. Henry stepped inside, shaking the snow from his furs, and closed the door against the raging wind. The sound of the howling gale was a constant reminder of their isolation, a wild, untamed voice in the profound silence of the forest. The scent of pine resin and wood smoke from the hearth filled the small space, a small comfort against the biting cold. Honora watched him, her hand still clutching her journal, her eyes a mixture of fear and a strange, reluctant curiosity. He is a creature of this wild, she thought, as unyielding as the mountains. But there is a hidden current in his gaze, like a river beneath ice. The distant mournful cry of a lone wolf echoed through the storm, a sound that seemed to mirror her own profound sense of solitude. But now she was not entirely alone. She was trapped with this stranger, this man of the wilderness, and in the heart of the storm a fragile, uncertain spark had been ignited. Days bled into weeks, each one marked by the relentless rhythm of the storm. The world outside the small cabin was a maelstrom of wind and snow, a wild, chaotic dance of white. But within the lodge, a fragile intimacy began to bloom, warmed by the flickering firelight and the slow, hesitant unfolding of two solitary lives. The initial wary tension that had hung between them like a shroud began to dissipate, replaced by a growing understanding, a quiet recognition of a shared, unspoken loneliness. Confined by the snow, they began to learn the contours of each other's pasts. Henry, a man of few words, spoke in fragments, his stories like stones worn smooth by the river of time. He told her of a life in the East, a life of noise and crowds and a suffocating hypocrisy that had driven him to seek solace in the vast, silent wilderness. He spoke of a disillusionment with society, a betrayal he did not name but that had etched deep lines of cynicism around his eyes. He had come to the wild seeking a kind of purity, a stark, honest reality that the world of men had denied him. And Nora, in turn, shared the tragic tale of her missionary expedition. She spoke of her father's fervent, unwavering faith, a faith that had led them into this untamed land with Bibles and hymns, armed against the wilderness with nothing but their belief. She spoke of the illness, a swift and merciless plague that had claimed her family and colleagues, leaving her the sole survivor in a landscape of death. And she spoke of the tribe, the silent, gentle people who had emerged from the mist like spirits, their faces painted with ochre and kindness. They had nursed her back to health with herbal remedies and a quiet, patient care that had felt like a benediction. And then they had vanished, leaving behind only a handful of carved wooden totems and a profound, unanswered question. They came out of the mist like spirits, she said one evening, her voice soft, her gaze lost in the dancing flames of the hearth. They showed me kindness when the world had only shown me loss. I owe them my life, and an answer. Henry watched her, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. She speaks of spirits, he thought, but she is the most spirited soul I've encountered in a decade. Her sorrow is a deep well, but her determination a towering peak. They fell into a routine born of necessity and a surprising unspoken companionship. They mended his traps, her small nimble fingers surprisingly adept at the intricate work. They prepared their meagre meals together, the small cabin filled with the aroma of roasting rabbit and the bitter, comforting scent of coffee, shared from a single tin cup. Their movements, initially hesitant and clumsy, became a synchronized, unconscious dance. They moved around each other in the small space with a growing ease, a silent acknowledgement of the other's presence. The nights were the hardest, the howling wind a constant reminder of their vulnerability. On one particularly fierce night, the storm seemed to claw at the very foundations of the cabin, the wind a ravenous beast seeking entry. The cold was a physical presence, a creeping, insidious thing that even the fire could not entirely hold at bay. They huddled together under a single, coarse blanket, the shared warmth a small, defiant act against the vast, indifferent cold. They did not speak, but in the shared silence, in the small, intimate sounds of their breathing, a new language was being forged. He felt the fragile tremble of her body next to his, and an unfamiliar, protective instinct stirred within him. He was a man who had prided himself on his solitude, on his self-sufficiency. But in the quiet darkness of the cabin, he found himself wanting to shield her from the storm, from the grief that still clung to her like a winter frost. He began to see past her fragility, to the remarkable resilience and keen intellect that lay beneath. Honora, in turn, felt a warmth she had not known since her family had perished, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. His presence, once a source of fear and uncertainty, had become a comfort, a steady, grounding force in her tumultuous world. She saw beyond his gruff exterior, to the deep, quiet strength and surprising tenderness that he kept hidden from the world. His presence, she thought, as she drifted off to sleep, her head resting on his shoulder, like the steady glow of the embers, chases away the chill that has settled in my bones. One evening, after a long, companionable silence, he spoke, his voice low and thoughtful. "This wilderness, it strips you bare, doesn't it? Shows you what truly matters." She looked at him, her blue eyes reflecting the firelight. "Yes," she whispered, "it does." The rhythmic drip of melting snow from the eaves had begun, a slow, steady metronome marking the passage of time. The storm was breaking, but in the heart of the lodge, in the shared warmth of the fire and the quiet intimacy of their forced confinement, something new and fragile had taken root, a hesitant bond that felt as real and as vital as the coming spring. The first signs of spring arrived not with a gentle thaw, but with a sudden, almost violent awakening. The relentless drip of melting snow from the eaves became a steady, rushing cascade. The sound of rushing water, once a distant whisper, grew to a roar as the frozen rivers began to break free from their icy prisons. The world outside the cabin was being reborn, but instead of relief, the coming of spring brought a palpable sense of dread. The end of their isolation was imminent, and with it, the encroachment of a world they had both, in their own ways, sought to escape. The arrival of the scout was as abrupt as the thaw. He was a wiry, weathered man, his face a roadmap of hard-bitten experience. He had braved the melting snow and treacherous half-frozen rivers to deliver a message from the Hudson's Bay Company. It was an ultimatum, its language curt and official, demanding Honora's immediate return. Rumours of the lost expedition had reached the ears of civilization, and the company, ever mindful of its reputation, wanted the matter settled. "They seek you, Miss Quinn," Henry said, his voice gruff as he handed to her the creased and damp message. "The world beyond these woods demands its due." Honora read the message, her hands trembling. The words on the page felt like a summons from a life she no longer recognized, a life of drawing rooms and polite society, of stifling corsets and meaningless pleasantries. Simultaneously, the scout brought word of her own family. A search party sent by her distant relatives was on its way, but their concern, she knew, was not for her welfare, but for her inheritance, for the potential scandal of a young, unmarried woman lost in the wilderness. "My family," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "They care only for appearances, but to stay, to leave my past unsettled, feels a betrayal." The weight of her lost companions, of her unresolved grief, settled upon her once more. The warmth they had cultivated in the small cabin, like fragile spring shoots, was threatened by the frost of expectation and duty. A tension thick and suffocating descended upon the small lodge. The easy companionship they had forged in the heart of the storm was replaced by a strained silence, a distance that felt as vast and as cold as the winter snows. They retreated into themselves, each grappling with their own fears, their own uncertainties about the future. Henry watched her, his heart a cold, hard knot in his chest. The thought of losing her, of returning to the silent company of the pines, was a pain he had not anticipated. He had grown accustomed to the sound of her voice, to the sight of her bent over her journal, her brow furrowed in concentration. He had grown accustomed to her. To bring her back to that world, to the stifling constraints of a society he despised, felt like caging a wild bird. But what claim had he to keep her here? He was a trapper, a man of the wild, a man with nothing to offer a woman of her station. Your world is one of drawing rooms and polite society, he thought, the words a bitter taste in his mouth. Mine of traps and silent forests. The silver locket she wore, a last tangible link to her lost family, seemed to glint with a new, accusatory light. It was a reminder of who she was, of the world to which she belonged. A map, spread out on the table, marked the vast, daunting distance between the lodge and civilization, a stark visual representation of their impending choice. The sudden quiet after a snowfall, once a source of peace, now felt heavy and oppressive, filled with unspoken words, with the weight of their divergent paths. Honora, too, felt the chasm opening between them. She saw the familiar, guarded expression return to Henry's face, the stoicism he used as a shield against the world. The warmth and tenderness he had shown her in the heart of the storm seemed to have retreated, like a river freezing over once more. The lodge, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage, a place of confinement where she was forced to confront the impossible choice before her. To leave was to betray the memory of her lost companions, to abandon her search for the tribe who had saved her life. But to stay was to defy the world, to abandon her family, her inheritance, her entire life. And what of Henry? He was a man of the wild, a man who had made his peace with solitude. Could she ask him to share his life with her, to disrupt the quiet rhythm of his existence? The dripping water outside the cabin was no longer a comforting sound, but a ticking clock, each drop a reminder of the inexorable march of time, of the world that was coming to claim her. The rift between them grew wider with each passing day, a silent, painful chasm filled with the unspoken anxieties of a future that seemed determined to tear them apart. The air in the lodge grew thick and heavy, charged with the unspoken desires and raw, festering fears that had taken root in the silence between them. The approaching spring, with its tumultuous, roaring river and the raw, earthy scent of awakening soil, seemed to mirror the storm that was brewing within the small cabin. The fire, once a source of comfort, now crackled with a nervous, urgent energy, casting long dancing shadows that seemed to writhe on the walls like tormented spirits. The confrontation, when it finally came, was as sudden and as violent as a summer squall. It was ignited by the arrival of another message, this one from Honora's family, delivered by a second, equally determined scout. It was not a request but a command, laced with threats of legal action and social ruin. They would see her returned, whether she wished it or not. "They will drag me back," Honora said, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and despair. She crumpled the letter in her fist, her knuckles white. "They will put me on display, a cautionary tale for any woman who dares to stray from the path they have chosen for her." "Then you must go," Henry said, his voice flat, his face a mask of stoic indifference. But his eyes, dark and turbulent, betrayed the storm that raged within him. "Go?" she cried, her voice rising. "Go where? Back to a life that feels like a tomb, to a world that values appearances above all else." She paced the small space like a caged animal, her movements frantic, desperate. "Do you not see, Henry? I cannot simply walk away from what happened here. I cannot abandon the only place I have felt truly alive since the ice claimed them." Her words, raw and desperate, hung in the air between them, a challenge and a plea. And in that moment, the dam of his carefully constructed solitude, the wall he had built around his heart for a decade, finally broke. "What of me, Honora?" he asked, his voice a low, ragged growl. He stepped towards her, closing the distance between them, his gaze intense, his usual stoicism cracked by the storm within him. "Do you imagine this time, these weeks, have meant nothing but duty?" He reached out, his calloused hand gently cupping her cheek. His touch was electric, a jolt of raw, unadulterated sensation that sent a shiver through her. She leaned into his touch, her eyes, wide and searching, meeting his. The air crackled with a tension that was no longer born of fear or uncertainty, but of a raw, undeniable desire. "What are you saying, Henry?" she whispered, her breath catching in her throat. He said nothing. Instead, he pulled her closer, his other hand finding the small of her back, drawing her against him, a scent of pine and man, a scent that had become as familiar to her as her own, enveloped her. Their bodies pressed together, a hesitant fit at first, then a surrender, a perfect, exquisite alignment of bone and muscle and flesh. His lips found hers, not with the gentle expiration of a first kiss, but with a desperate, all-consuming hunger, a kiss of longing and of quiet, profound understanding. It was a kiss that spoke of lonely nights and shared fears, of a connection forged in the heart of the storm. It was slow, deliberate, a deep, languorous exploration of the contours of her mouth, as if he were seeking a lost language, a forgotten truth. Her hands rose, her fingers tangling in the thick, dark hair at the nape of his neck, clutching his deerskin vest as if to anchor herself in this new, exhilarating reality. He deepened the kiss, a soft groan escaping him as she responded with an eagerness that matched his own, her mouth opening under his, a silent invitation. Their sighs mingled in the quiet lodge, a testament to the powerful, undeniable current that had flowed between them, now unleashed. He lifted her then, his strong arms cradling her as if she were as weightless as a feather, and carried her to the narrow cot, the one she had slept in alone for so long. He laid her down gently, his eyes never leaving hers, his gaze a mixture of reverence and a raw, untamed hunger. He began to undress her, his fingers, surprisingly nimble for a man of his size and strength, working the buttons of her simple dress with a slow, deliberate care. Each touch was a caress, a spark that ignited a fire deep within her. The rough, callous skin of his hands against the soft, smooth skin of her belly, her ribs, her breasts, was a revelation, a sensory explosion that left her breathless. She, in turn, reached for him, her hands clumsy with a need that was as new as it was overwhelming. She pulled at his deerskin vest, her fingers fumbling with the leather ties. He stilled her hands, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Are you sure?" he murmured, his voice rough with an emotion she could not name. "Yes," she said, her voice a soft, certain whisper. "I want you." The shirt fell away, and she ran her hands over the hard planes of his chest, marvelling at the heat of his skin. He drew her to him, their bodies fitting together with a closeness that stole her breath. His mouth moved from hers, tracing a path of fire down her throat to the hollow of her collarbone, a silent promise of what was to come. She gasped, her hands clinging to him as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had dissolved into pure sensation. Her back arched as he held her, a silent, instinctive plea. He moved with her, his body a warm, steady presence that was both a comfort and a promise. He laid her gently on the narrow cot, the rough blanket a stark contrast to the softness of the moment. In the dim, flickering light, his eyes were dark and tender, full of a vow that made her heart ache with a beautiful, terrifying vulnerability. He held her close, the warmth of his body a profound comfort against the chilling prospects of the world outside. The sound of the river, a tumultuous roar, was a distant echo to the thunder of their own hearts. "Stay," he murmured against her hair. The single word, a profound plea, a promise, a prayer. "Stay with me." There was only this raw elemental connection, a perfect and exquisite union of two solitary souls. As he leaned over her, the last thing she saw before her eyes drifted closed was the profound love in his gaze, and she surrendered not just her body but her heart into his keeping. In the aftermath of their passion, in the quiet intimacy of their shared embrace, the choice was made. It was not a choice born of logic or reason, but of a deep, undeniable truth. They belonged here, in this wild, untamed land, together. The decision once made settled upon them with the gentle, quiet grace of a summer dawn. The frantic, desperate energy that had consumed them was replaced by a profound sense of peace, a quiet, joyful certainty that resonated with the vibrant, awakening wilderness around them. The lodge, once a refuge from the storm, a crucible for their burgeoning love, was now a foundation, the cornerstone of a new beginning. They chose to remain, to turn their backs on the world that sought to claim them, to forge a new life in the heart of the wild. Henry, with a quiet determination, committed to helping Honora find the answers she sought. Together they began to explore the surrounding forests, not as intruders but as inhabitants, their movements guided by a shared purpose and a growing respect for the land. They did not find the tribe, but they found signs of their passage, subtle, eloquent clues that spoke of a deliberate spiritual migration rather than a tragedy. They found an ancient burial ground nestled in a secluded grove of ancient cedars, the graves tended with a care that suggested a recent reverent departure. They found a hidden message etched into a rock face, a series of symbols that seemed to speak of a journey, of a people moving on, not in haste but with a sense of purpose, of a connection to a land that was not bound by a single location. It was enough. It was the closure Honora had so desperately sought, a release from the burden of her past. They returned to the lodge no longer as two solitary individuals, but as a unit, a partnership. They began to adapt the small cabin, making it their permanent home. Henry, with his practical knowledge of the wilderness, taught her how to read the signs of the forest, how to track game, how to survive and to thrive in this untamed land. Honora, with her keen intellect and her artist's eye, brought a new sense of beauty and order to their small world. She cultivated a small garden, coaxing vibrant green shoots from the rich, dark earth. She filled her journal not with fragmented memories of loss, but with intricate sketches of their new life, of the wild flowers that bloomed in the meadows, of the eagles that soared overhead, a symbol of their newfound freedom and partnership. Their life was one of hard work, of shared labour, but it was a life of profound joy. They built not just a home, but a future, a life defined by their mutual respect, their deep, abiding love, and their shared connection to the land. The lodge, once a symbol of their forced intimacy, was now a testament to their chosen one, its small rooms filled with the comfortable clutter of a shared life, the scent of wood smoke and wild flowers, of love and of home. Months later, as the gentle, languid warmth of summer settled over the valley, they stood by the river, the water rushing past, a strong, steady current that mirrored the quiet flow of their contentment. The sun, a golden benediction, filtered through the lush, green canopy of leaves. dappling their skin with a warm, gentle light. Henry turned to Anora, his gaze soft, reverent. Her hand, no longer pale and thin, but strong and sun-kissed, reached for his, their fingers intertwined, a comfortable, familiar joining that spoke of countless shared moments, of a love that had grown as wild and as resilient as the forest around them. He pulled her gently into his embrace, and she rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady, comforting beat of his heart, a rhythm that had become as familiar to her as her own. The gentle caress of his hand on her back, through the light fabric of her simple dress, sent a quiet tremor through her, a familiar, delicious ache that was both a memory and a promise. "This," he whispered, his voice a low, contented rumble. "This is home, Anora." She looked up at him, her eyes bright with a love that was as deep and as boundless as the wilderness that surrounded them. "More than home," she replied, her voice thick with an emotion that was too profound for words. "It is everything." He bent his head, their lips meeting in a kiss that was both tender and deeply passionate, a kiss that spoke of quiet mornings and shared labour, of long, languid afternoons and nights filled with a fierce, unbridled passion. It was a kiss that held the promise of forever, a promise forged in the untamed heart of the wilderness, a quiet affirmation of their shared future. It was a kiss that spoke of a love that had found its truest expression far from the judging eyes of the world, a love as untamed, as enduring, and as beautiful as the land itself. In the heart of the wild, where the world had once taken everything, they had found not just survival, but a love as enduring and boundless as the ancient forests, a whispered promise carried on the wind that some souls are destined to bloom far beyond the reach of civilization. Eitan and Ruth, an Oxford love story. The soul of Oxford in late autumn was a melancholic inhalation of decay, the sweet fungal scent of fallen leaves dissolving into damp earth, the sharp perfume of rain on ancient, indifferent stone. It was a city of ghosts, and Ruth Adler felt their chill in her bones. An American adrift in a sea of hushed reverence, she found the university's grandeur less inspiring than oppressive. Its halls, built for the certitude of centuries, seemed to mock her very modern, very private state of intellectual and emotional confusion. She was a scholar of questions in a world that seemed to trade only in prescribed answers. It was this feeling of being unmoored that led her to a sparsely populated lecture on medieval Jewish philosophy, held in a forgotten room in a lesser-known college. The air was thick with the brittle aroma of old paper and beeswax. Sunlight, thin and golden as spun sugar, slanted through a high, mullioned window, illuminating dancing motes of dust. She took a seat at the back, expecting little more than a dry recitation of historical facts, a way to pass an evening that threatened to stretch into an eternity of loneliness. Then he began to speak, and the air in the room changed. His name was Eitan Halberstam. He was Israeli, the introduction had noted, a visiting lecturer of some renown. He was a man built of quiet contradictions. Tall and spare, with the stoop of a lifelong academic, he possessed a stillness that bordered on sorrowful. His dark hair was threaded with premature grey at the temples, and his face, handsome in a severe scholarly way, was etched with lines of a grief that seemed too old for his years. Yet when he spoke of Maimonides, the 12th century sage, his voice, though low, was imbued with a contained, smouldering passion. It was as if he held a fire in his cupped hands, careful not to let it burn him. Ruth leaned forward, forgetting the cold, the ghosts, the weight of her own displacement. He was not merely lecturing, he was wrestling with the text, pulling it from the dust of history into the unstable light of the present. He spoke of the guide for the perplexed, not as a static theological treatise, but as a living, breathing map of doubt. After the lecture, as the handful of attendees shuffled out with polite nods, Ruth remained in her seat. A question had taken root in her, a seed that his words had watered. These halls felt so cold, so full of ghosts, who spoke a language I couldn't understand, she thought. And then he spoke, and it was as if he'd given a voice to my own silent questions. She gathered her things and approached the front of the hall, where he was carefully placing his notes into a worn leather briefcase. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a small cage. "Dora Halberstam?" He looked up. His eyes were a deep, complicated brown, and for a moment they held the guarded look of a man accustomed to being left alone. "Yes? I'm Ruth Adler. I'm a doctoral student from New York." She felt a blush creep up her neck. "I hope this isn't an imposition, but your lecture, you spoke of the deliberate contradictions in Maimonides." He gave a slight formal nod, his gaze sharpening with professional interest. "I did. You presented it as philosophical necessity, a way to speak to both the simple believer and the sophisticated thinker. But I wondered," she hesitated, then plunged ahead, "I wondered if it wasn't also a spiritual one, a reflection of our own internal state. How can one have faith in a world that is so full of inherent contradictions, beauty and cruelty, order and chaos, unless God himself is found precisely in that tension, in the struggle, not in the resolution?" He went utterly still. His hand, which had been about to close the latch on his briefcase, rested on the worn leather. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and the professional veil dropped. She saw something flash in his eyes, not surprise, but a profound, startling recognition. It was as if she had spoken a password to a secret society of which they were the only two members. He gestured toward a massive leather-bound volume on the lectern, its pages the colour of old cream. The texture of its cover looked as brittle and fragile as ancient history itself. "That," he said, his voice softer now, losing its lecturer's formality, "is the very heart of the matter. The contradiction is the point." He met her eyes, and the space between them became charged, electric. The low amber light from the single desk lamp seemed to pool around them, separating them from the rest of the darkening room. It is where God allows us to find him, in the space between what is written and what is felt. He held her gaze for a beat too long, a silent acknowledgement of a shared language. In that moment, an entire conversation passed between them, one of loneliness, of seeking, of a mutual understanding that ran far deeper than the text they discussed. The air vibrated with it, a low hum of connection. Then, as if catching himself, he blinked. The mask of polite distance slid back into place. He snapped his briefcase shut with a decisive click. "A very astute observation, Miss Adler. Thank you for attending." He gave her another curt nod and turned, his footsteps echoing on the old wooden floor as he walked away, leaving Ruth standing in the amber light, the scent of rain on stone suddenly sharp in her nostrils, her world subtly, irrevocably tilted on its axis. Their subsequent encounters began with the curated randomness that academic life affords. A shared table in the cavernous silence of the Bodleian Library, a nod across a quadrangle slick with rain. These meetings were cloaked in the guise of intellectual discourse. They would debate the Kabbalistic interpretations of creation or the influence of Aristotle on Jewish thought, but beneath the surface of their words, another conversation was taking place. It was in the way his eyes would soften when she made a point he admired, or the way her breath would catch when he leaned closer to trace a line of text in a book they were sharing, his finger hovering just above the page. One grey misty afternoon, he suggested they walk. The air was thick and damp, blurring the hard Gothic edges of the colleges and muffling the distant chime of a chapel bell. They followed the path along the River Cherwell, the water a sheet of polished slate, carrying a flotilla of fallen leaves. A single bright red one caught her eye, a splash of vibrant life on the sombre, flowing water. For a long while they walked in a comfortable silence, a quiet communion that required no words. Then, as they watched a punt glide by, its pole stirring the murky depths, Eitan spoke, his voice low. "My wife. She was an archaeologist. She loved this fog." He said it to the river, not to Ruth, his gaze fixed on the opposite bank. She used to say that history wasn't in the artifacts themselves, but in the spaces between them, the missing pieces. She said the fog did that to the city. It hid the solid things and forced you to see the shapes in between. It was the first time he had mentioned a wife. The word hung in the air, heavy and real. Ruth's heart clenched, not with jealousy, but with a sudden, aching understanding of the sorrow he carried. She didn't offer facile condolences. Instead, she honoured the raw intimacy of the confession with her own. "I think that's what I've been looking for," she said softly. "Not just in my dissertation, but in everything. A unifying theory. Something to make sense of the missing pieces in my own life. It's why I came here. I thought I'd find it in the architecture of old ideas, but instead I just feel unmoored." He finally turned to look at her, and his eyes were unguarded, filled with a shared melancholy. "I am beginning to understand what she meant," he said, and the she was a ghost between them, but for the first time it was a gentle one, not a barrier. Their next meeting was in a cramped, book-lined tea shop off the high street, a haven of warmth against the encroaching chill of late November. The air smelled of steamed milk and old paperbacks. He brought a book for her, a slim, rare volume on Maimonides' esoteric teachings. "I thought this might interest you," he said, pushing it across the table. When she opened it, she saw it was his personal copy. The margins were filled with his faint pencil annotations, elegant script that was as much a query as it was a statement. Questions, corrections, little arrows connecting disparate ideas. It was a map of his mind. Sharing it was an act of profound trust, a gesture of intellectual intimacy that felt more significant than any physical touch. She looked up at him, the shared warmth of the teapot a tangible thing between their hands. "Eitan," she began, using his first name for the first time. It felt both natural and momentous. "Ruth," he replied, and the simple sound of her name in his mouth was a quiet affirmation. She spent that night in her small, cold room, not reading the book's printed words, but his. She traced the faint graphite lines with her fingertip, a shiver running through her. "His thoughts are here, on the page," she mused, a slow, deep ache spreading through her chest. "It feels more intimate than a touch. It feels like a soul. The distance between New York and Oxford, between student and lecturer, between his grief and her searching seemed to dissolve in the quiet act of reading his mind on the page. The first breath of true winter swept through Oxford, stripping the last defiant leaves from the trees and leaving their skeletal silhouettes stark against a steel-grey sky. The melancholy beauty of autumn curdled into a harsher, colder reality, and with it the easy warmth between Ruth and Eitan began to leach away. The catalyst was a letter, thin and blue, bearing an American postmark. It lay on Ruth's desk, like a summons. Her university in New York had confirmed the date of her required return, outlining a rigid schedule for her doctoral defence. The abstract notion of her departure, once a distant haze on the horizon, now had a date, a time, a stark finality. It was in 6 weeks. The words seemed to rearrange the very molecules in the air, making it harder to breathe. She didn't tell Eitan about the letter, but he seemed to sense the shift in her. A new distress hummed just beneath her skin, and he, a man preternaturally sensitive to the nuances of sorrow, responded not by drawing closer, but by retreating. It was a strategic withdrawal into the cold, safe territory of his work. Their meetings, which had become the anchors of her week, grew strained. The comfortable silences were now filled with a tense, unspoken weight. The flow of conversation, once a rushing river, became a trickle, meandering around safe academic subjects. He was Dr. Halberstam again, and she was Ms. Adler. They were two scholars in a library, nothing more. The change was a constant dull ache in Ruth's chest. The silence between them in a crowded, buzzing common room was more profound and deafening than the hush of the Bodleian had ever been. She felt as though she were watching him recede down a long corridor, growing smaller and more distant with each passing day. Finally, she could bear it no longer. She caught up with him after a seminar, in a stone-flagged passage that echoed with the footfalls of departing students. The chill of a stone wall seeped through the thin wool of her coat as she stood before him, blocking his path. "Eitan." He stopped, his eyes not quite meeting hers. "Ruth, was there a point in the seminar you wish to clarify?" His tone was polite, formal, and it cut her more deeply than any harsh word could have. "No," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I want to clarify this. Us. What is happening?" She took a breath, summoning her courage. "I don't understand. We were talking, really talking. Now it feels as if we're standing on opposite sides of a locked gate. Did you lose the key, or did you choose to throw it away?" His gaze finally lifted to meet hers, and she saw a flicker of the man from the riverbank, the man from the tea shop, his eyes full of a pain he was trying so desperately to contain. He looked away toward the grey, unforgiving sky visible through a high window. "The key was never mine to give," he said, his voice quiet and rough. He confessed then, not in a torrent, but in spare, clipped sentences that felt like stones being dropped into a deep well. He spoke of his grief not as a wound that was healing, but as a country he now inhabited, a place with immutable borders and a permanent population of one. "My world has finite borders now," he said, turning back to her. The agony in his expression was so naked it made her want to look away. "I cannot ask you to live in such a small country. It would be a cruelty to let you believe I could offer you anything more than these fleeting conversations. To pretend otherwise would be a lie, and we have been nothing if not honest with each other." The words were meant to be a kindness, a gentle severance, but they felt like a judgment. He was closing a door she hadn't even realised she'd been hoping to walk through. The careful, formal politeness he wrapped around his confession was worse than a heated argument. It was a dismissal. "I see," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. She stepped aside, clearing the path for him. "I am sorry, Ruth," he murmured, and the genuine regret in his voice was the most painful part of all. He walked past her, his footsteps echoing down the cold corridor until they faded, leaving her alone with the chill of the stone against her back and a silence that was absolute. A storm born of the Atlantic had hurled itself across England and now beat against Oxford with a wild, relentless fury. Rain lashed the leaded glass of Eitan's college rooms, and the wind howled in the chimneys like a tormented spirit. The turmoil outside was a pale reflection of the tempest inside Ruth. It was her last night. Her flight was in the morning. She stood outside his door, the rare book he had lent her held tightly in her hands. Returning it was to be a final, formal act of closure, a neat tying off of a thread that had frayed into painful silence. She raised her hand to knock, the book a cold, hard shield against her chest. He opened the door, and for a moment they simply stood there, the pretense of formality, a fragile skin stretched taut between them. He looked exhausted, his eyes shadowed, the firelight from within his study catching the silver in his hair. "You're leaving," he said. It wasn't a question. "In the morning," she confirmed, holding out the book. "I came to return this." He took it, their fingers brushing. The contact was an electric shock, arcing across the cold space that had grown between them. He didn't step aside to let her in, nor did he close the door. They remained in the liminal space of the doorway, the storm raging around them. "The storm is terrible," he said, his voice rough. "You shouldn't walk back in this. Come in, wait for it to pass, one last glass of whiskey." It was an appeal, not a polite offer. She nodded, a single sharp movement, and stepped inside. His study was his sanctuary, a world walled in by books. They lined every surface, piled on the floor, their spines a mosaic of faded gilt and dark leather. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, peat smoke from the flickering fire, and whiskey. The firelight cast huge, dancing shadows that made the room seem both a fortress and a cage. He poured them each a glass, the amber liquid catching the light. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken words. The whiskey burned a welcome path down her throat. Finally she spoke, her voice raw. "You hide in here, don't you? You build walls of books and theories and you call it grief, but it's fear. You're hiding from life." His head snapped up, his eyes blazing with a sudden defensive anger. "And what would you know of it? You with your theories and your youthful confidence. You romanticize a pain you cannot possibly understand. You look at my life like it's one of your texts, something to be analysed and solved." "I look at you like you're a man She cut herself off, unable to say the word. "A man I care for, who is choosing to entomb himself alive. Is that what she would have wanted? The archaeologist? For you to stop digging, to stop searching?" The argument was the spark thrown into the tinder of their pent-up frustration and longing. It escalated quickly, their voices rising over the shriek of the wind. Accusations became confessions. Anger melted into desperation. "You don't know what you're asking of me," he shot back, his control shattering. He slammed his glass down, whiskey sloshing over the rim. "I am a landscape of ruins, Ruth. Do you hear me? There is nothing left to build with." "Then let me be a ruin with you," she cried, tears finally breaking free, tracing hot paths down her cold cheeks. "Don't you see, I don't want your perfection, I want your contradictions. I want the man who understands that faith is found in the struggle. I want you." The words hung in the air, a raw, undeniable truth. The anger drained from his face, replaced by a devastating vulnerability. He crossed the space between them in 2 strides, his hands coming up to frame her face, his thumbs wiping away her tears. "Ruth," he whispered, his voice broken. He kissed her then, and it was not gentle. It was a kiss of desperation, of starvation. It was like he was trying to solve an unsolvable question, his mouth searching and hungry on hers. It was the culmination of every unspoken thought, every shared glance, every painful silent moment. The argument died on their lips, replaced by the raw, irrefutable language of need. His tweed jacket was rough against her cheek as she pressed into him, her hand sliding from his shoulders up into his thick hair, pulling him closer, anchoring herself to him. It was a kiss of fire and fragility, a dance of profound longing and heartbreaking tenderness. When their bodies pressed together, the length of him hard against her, it was an answer, not to the future but to the overwhelming, painful present. His hands, shaking slightly, moved from her face, tracing the curve of her back, his touch both a plea and a surrender. Shivers racked her body. He broke the kiss only to murmur her name against her lips, a prayer in the firelit quiet. With a shared, ragged gasp, they began to shed the layers that separated them, the buttons of her coat, the knot of his tie, the hooks of her bra, all clumsy, urgent impediments. Clothes became a frustrating impediment, a barrier to the truth they both desperately needed. Fabric whispered to the floor, a tide of wool and cotton at their feet, until there was nothing left but the heated rush of skin meeting skin. The air itself seemed to crackle, charged with a current that ran from his fingertips to her soul. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing, his touch reverent, and carried her the few feet to the worn Persian rug before the fire. The heat of the flames licked at her back as he laid her down, his body covering hers not as a weight, but as a promise. He looked down at her, his eyes dark with a mixture of reverence and a raw, untamed hunger. The firelight sculpted the planes of his face, casting shadows that danced and deepened. Her gasp turned into a soft moan as his hands began a slow, deliberate exploration. He touched her as if he were a blind man learning a masterpiece by feel, as if he were memorizing the very essence of her. His fingers traced the elegant curve of her hip, the sensitive line of her back, the hollow of her throat where her pulse beat a frantic rhythm against his lips. She arched into his touch, a silent plea and a fierce acceptance all at once, her own hands roaming the hard, tense muscles of his back, his shoulders, pulling him closer into the inferno. This was a place beyond intellect, beyond words. This was the country of the body, a wild and uncharted territory they were discovering together, guided only by instinct and a soul-deep ache of longing. There was a shift, a deepening, a final breathless surrender, as two bodies became one current, moving in a rhythm as old as the storm lashing the windows. The world dissolved into heat and shadow, the frantic beat of two hearts, and the overwhelming sensation of being utterly, finally found. They clung to each other in the flickering firelight, two souls who had finally erased the distance, finding a desperate, beautiful, and profound solace not in words, but in the undeniable truth of the flesh. The storm passed in the deep hours of the night, leaving a profound baptismal silence in its wake. Morning arrived not with a triumphant sun, but with a soft pearlescent grey light that filtered through the rain-washed windows of Eitan's study. It was a world made new, clean and quiet. They awoke on the rug before the cold hearth, tangled in each other, and a stray blanket he had pulled over them at some point. For a long time they didn't speak. The academic pretense, the roles of lecturer and student, the armour of grief and the shield of intellect, all had been burned away in the night's fever. What was left was something simpler, more fragile and infinitely more real. A man and a woman in the quiet aftermath. He stirred first, propping himself up on an elbow to look at her. He gently brushed a strand of hair from her cheek, his touch tentative, as if he were afraid she might vanish. She opened her eyes and met his gaze. There was no artifice left in him, only a deep, tremulous honesty. He didn't speak of the future, of her flight, of the impossible logistics that separated them. Instead, he stood, unabashed in his nakedness, and went to make coffee. The simple domestic act was more intimate than anything they had yet shared. He returned with 2 steaming mugs, and they sat together on the floor, the blanket wrapped around their shoulders, the taste of strong black coffee chasing away the last ghosts of the night. Later, as she was dressing, pulling on her clothes in the soft morning light, the unspoken question, "What now?" hung in the air, heavy and fragile. The silence was no longer tense, but it was filled with the enormous weight of the Atlantic Ocean and the thousands of miles that would soon separate them. Eitan, who had been watching the quiet street from his window, turned and walked to his desk. His movements were deliberate, thoughtful. He took out 2 small, stiff cards from a drawer and uncapped his fountain pen. The scratch of the nib on the card was the only sound in the room. He wrote his address, his name, his college, Oxford, in his elegant, scholarly script. He walked over to her and held the card out. "So you know where to find me," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Ruth's fingers trembled slightly as she took it. The card felt solid, real, a tangible piece of her future. It was an anchor. Then he offered her the fountain pen and the second blank card. "And you, Ruth," he said softly, "so I know where to find you." It was a request, but it felt like a vow. She took the heavy pen from him, its weight familiar and comforting. On the blank card she wrote her own name and her address in New York. The simple act felt monumental. a formal pact made in the quiet of the morning. They were no longer two separate people defined by his past and her imminent departure. They were 2 points on a map, and they'd just drawn the first line between them. She handed him the card and their fingers brushed. He looked down at her handwriting, then back up at her, a look of profound, settled determination in his eyes. He carefully slid the card into the breast pocket of his shirt, placing it over his heart. "Good," he said, a small, genuine smile finally reaching his eyes. "Now we can continue our conversation." He insisted on walking her to where her taxi would be waiting. The streets of Oxford smelled of wet earth and clean air. The stone of the colleges seemed less imposing, softened by the damp, its grey hues richer in the morning light. Their conversation was simple, practical, about the time, the traffic, the weight of her luggage. Yet every mundane word was heavy with unspoken meaning, a testament to the new reality between them. The black cab was waiting at the corner of the lane, its engine a low thrum in the quiet morning. This was it, the moment of separation. But as she moved to open the taxi door, he took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, holding fast. The emotional barrier that had stood between them for weeks was gone, replaced by a tangible, physical connection. "You will write," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, a command, a plea. "I will write," she answered, her voice steady. He leaned in and his mouth found hers. This kiss was a stark, stunning contrast to the storm of the night before. There was no desperation in it, no hunger, only a profound and certain tenderness. It was a kiss of quiet promise, a long, deep and searching affirmation in the crisp morning air. His other hand came up to gently trace her jawline, his thumb brushing the corner of her lip as if to seal the promise there. "Be safe, Ruth," he whispered against her mouth. It was a benediction. He opened the taxi door for her. She slid in, her eyes never leaving his. He held her gaze as he closed the door, his hand resting on the window for a moment before he stepped back. As the taxi began to pull away, she watched him grow smaller, a solitary figure standing against the backdrop of ancient stone. But he was not a ghost anymore. He was a man, solid and real, anchored in the hopeful light of a new day. The logistical chasms, the ocean, the continents, the careers remained, but they no longer felt like reasons to remain apart. They were merely problems to be solved. For two unfinished lives, grappling with the contradictions of the past and the uncertainties of the future, this was not an end. It was a difficult, fragile, and exquisitely beautiful beginning. Chords of a different song. The grand drawing room of the Ellison home in Bronzeville was a testament to a life meticulously arranged, each element a note in a carefully composed symphony. Polished mahogany gleamed under the soft glow of sconces, reflecting the muted floral patterns of the Persian rug. The air, perpetually perfumed with the delicate, almost mournful scent of lily of the valley, seemed to stifle any errant breeze, holding it captive within the stately confines. Viola Ellison, seated with an impeccable posture befitting her classical training, felt the familiar weight of these surroundings settle upon her, a silken shroud of expectation. Her fingers, long and graceful, twitched imperceptibly, as if yearning for the cool, crisp ivory of the piano keys, a realm where order reigned supreme. Tonight, the conversation, like the room itself, was perfectly orchestrated. Her fiancé, Julian Vance, a man whose ambition was as sharp and undeniable as his perfectly tailored suit, held court. His voice, calm and assured, resonated with the unwavering conviction of a rising NAACP leader discussing civil rights strategies. "Our path is clear, Viola," he articulated, his gaze sweeping over the gathered guests, prominent members of the black community, all echoing his earnest dedication. discipline, dedication, and an unshakable adherence to the standards we uphold. It is the only way forward to demonstrate our worth, our capability." Viola nodded, a practice gesture, her mind adrift. The words were righteous, important, a melody she had been taught since childhood, yet a disquiet hummed beneath her composure, a faint dissonance in her soul. It was during a brief lull, as a new round of drinks was served, that Julian's colleague, a man whose respectability was only surpassed by his stiff-necked disapproval of anything outside the established order, cleared his throat. "One hears of these new establishments," he began, his tone laced with distaste. "These underground jazz clubs springing up in less reputable parts of town. Just noise, of course. A distraction from the real work." He dismissed it with a wave of his hand, as though swatting away an annoying fly. Noise, a distraction. Viola felt a flicker of curiosity ignite within her, a forbidden thought, an audacious spark in the carefully banked embers of her existence. The word noise echoed in her mind, not as a condemnation, but as a thrilling possibility. The piano keys were an extension of her very soul, each note a perfect, predictable harmony. Yet, tonight, a different music called to me, a discordant, dangerous siren song that promised chaos, and perhaps truth. Days later, the quiet rebellion within her could no longer be contained. A thirst for something raw, something untamed by the strictures of her life propelled her. Under the guise of an evening stroll, Viola secretly ventured to the address whispered by Julian's colleague. The jazz club was tucked away down a dimly lit alley, a defiant pulse in the heart of the city. The moment she stepped inside, the world shifted on its axis. The air was a tangible entity, smoky and thick with the scent of whiskey and unspoken desires. Laughter, loud or unrestrained, mingled with the clinking of glasses and the insistent driving rhythm of a bass line. It was chaos, glorious and alive, a stark contrast to the polite, hushed conversations of her drawing room. Her eyes, still adjusting to the dimness, were drawn to the stage. There, bathed in the singular glow of a spotlight, stood a man with a saxophone, Samuel Cohen. His name, she would learn later, carried the quiet weight of tradition, yet his music was anything but. The saxophone was a living extension of him, a gleaming, brassy soul pouring out melodies that were both mournful and exhilarating, a wail of longing one moment, a joyous shout the next. He swayed, his eyes closed, lost in the intricate dance of notes, his whole being infused with the raw emotion of the music. And then, as if sensing her presence, his eyes opened. They were dark and intense, and they met hers across the crowded, swirling room. It was a moment of startling recognition, as though a chord had been struck deep within her that she had never known existed. The world shrank, the surrounding clamour fading into a distant hum. His lips, still curved from the last lingering note, parted in a brief knowing nod, a silent acknowledgement that transcended words. In that instant, amidst the smoky haze and the forbidden music, Viola felt a stirring of something entirely new, something dangerous and utterly compelling. The crisp, cool feel of piano ivory, her world of perfect harmony, suddenly felt brittle, while the smooth, warm brass of his saxophone promised a different kind of truth. A broken classical sheet music page, forgotten on her piano at home, seemed to symbolize the unraveling of her old life, while the smoky, whiskey-tinged air of the jazz club breathed new life into her lungs. The clandestine corners of Chicago's jazz scene became Viola's sanctuary, a stark counterpoint to the formal elegance of her Bronzeville home. The lily-of-the-valley scent of her drawing room gave way to the intoxicating aroma of stale cigarette smoke and the faint sweet trace of cheap perfume that clung to the velvet banquettes of the club. The tone of her life, once a measured andante, was becoming a hushed allegro, filled with the thrill of transgression and the burgeoning passion she found in Samuel Cohen's presence. At first, her excursions were cautious, tentative. She would slip away after her family retired, her footsteps hushed on the grand staircase, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She would sit in a dimly lit corner of the club, a ghost in the vibrant tapestry of the night, simply to listen. But her gaze, intense and unwavering, always found Samuel on stage. He in turn began to seek her out in the fleeting moments between sets. Drawn by the quiet intensity in her eyes, he would approach, a shy smile playing on his lips, the saxophone still warm from his touch slung casually over his shoulder. Their conversations began with music, a shared language that transcended their disparate worlds. He spoke of jazz not as mere notes on a page, but as a living, breathing entity, a spontaneous expression of the soul. "Music, Miss Ellison," he'd murmur, his voice a low, melodic rumble that sent shivers down her spine, "isn't about rules. It's about feeling. It's about breaking free." Viola, accustomed to the rigid structure of classical compositions, found herself captivated by his philosophy. She spoke of her own reverence for the masters, the mathematical precision of Bach, the soaring emotion of Chopin, but confessed, "My whole life I've played the notes perfectly, but what if the song itself is wrong for me?" He listened, truly listened, his dark eyes discerning, seeing past her polished exterior to the yearning beneath. "There's a fire in you, beneath all that calm," he observed, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "I hear it in the way you listen." These exchanges deepened, spilling over into late-night phone calls. Viola would wait until the house was silent, the last echoes of her mother's clinking teacups long faded. Huddled under a blanket in her room, a stolen moment of rebellion, she would listen as Samuel unveiled his world. He spoke of his family's history, of their journey to Chicago, of the quiet prejudices he faced, even within the city's seemingly diverse landscape. He shared his struggles to gain recognition, the relentless pursuit of his art in a society that often deemed it a novelty, or worse, a vice. In turn, Viola found herself revealing the stifled dreams she harboured, the crushing weight of her family's expectations, the gilded cage her life had become. Each whispered word, each shared glance was a thread weaving a tapestry of forbidden longing. It felt both terrifying and utterly irrevocably right. One rainy evening, the insistent rhythm of jazz drums still vibrating in her ears, Samuel walked her part of the way home. The city hummed around them, a symphony of distant traffic and falling rain. The cool, smooth feel of the rain on her skin was a balm, a cleansing sensation that washed away the day's polite falsehoods. There was a silent understanding passing between them, a recognition of a bond that defied logic or convention. As they reached the corner of her street, the streetlights casting long, distorted shadows, he stopped. Without a word, he gently took her hand, his fingers warm and strong against her own. The simple touch was a spark, igniting a fierce, undeniable attraction that had been simmering beneath the surface. It was a silent promise, a dangerous invitation to a world where music truly was about breaking free, and where the most illicit coffee shared in a dimly lit diner tasted sweeter than any grand feast. The walls of Viola's carefully constructed life began to show hairline cracks, each one a testament to the fragile intimacy she was cultivating in secret. The grand, unyielding architecture of society clashed ever more fiercely with the tender, clandestine world she shared with Samuel. The tone of her days grew increasingly tense, punctuated by moments of fear, guilt, and the suffocating pressure of external forces. Julian, with his keen eye for detail and his unwavering focus on their shared future, was the first to notice. It wasn't suspicion, not yet, but a subtle shift in her demeanour, a growing distraction that perturbed him. Her usual attentiveness had wavered during discussions of fundraising and community outreach. He confronted her one evening, his voice calm yet tinged with an almost paternal concern. "Viola," he began, his hand resting lightly on her arm, a gesture of ownership. "We have a purpose. Distractions, no matter how appealing, only serve to derail us. Our family, our community, they depend on us to uphold certain standards, to be exemplars." The clinking of ice in crystal glasses at a formal party, cold and brittle, seemed to underscore his words, chilling her to the bone. Soon, whispers began to circulate within the Bronzeville community, insubstantial at first, like smoke, then growing in density. Disapproving glances followed Viola at church. Hushed conversation ceased abruptly when she entered a room. The veiled judgments were a tangible weight, the oppressive presence of a fur stole draped too heavily over her shoulders. Her late-night excursions, once discreet, now seemed to broadcast themselves on the wind. Simultaneously, Samuel's world faced its own pressures. His club, a haven of vibrant expression, found itself under increased scrutiny. Conservative elements of the city, ever vigilant, viewed jazz, and particularly spaces where black and Jewish artists and patrons mingled, as a corrupting influence, a moral decay that threatened the fabric of society. Threats, thinly veiled at first, then more overt, began to circulate. The wail of a police siren in the distance, a common sound in the city, took on a more sinister resonance, a reminder of the precariousness of their chosen world. "This world," Samuel had said to her one night, his voice strained, heavy with weariness, "it doesn't want us to find harmony. It thrives on dissonance." The stark reality of her fractured existence was thrown into agonizing relief at a high-profile NOACP event. The ballroom glittered, a kaleidoscope of respectable finery and earnest ambition. Amidst the powerful speeches and grand pronouncements, Viola felt a profound sense of unreality. It was as if she were moving through a dream, a gilded charade. Then through the large arched windows she saw him. Samuel stood outside, watching from a distance, a lone figure against the glittering facade of her world. The saxophone, his constant companion, was not with him. The contrast between her two lives, the suffocating elegance within, and the raw, untamed passion embodied by the man outside was sharp and painful. The inevitable confrontation with her mother arrived like a meticulously delivered blow. Her mother, a woman of formidable will and unwavering adherence to propriety, sat across from her, her posture as rigid as Viola's own upbringing. There were no shouts, no histrionics, only a chillingly precise articulation of duty. "You carry the weight of generations, child," her mother stated, her voice devoid of warmth. "The sacrifices made for you, the path laid for your future. Do not cast it aside for a fleeting fancy." Viola's inner monologue screamed in protest. The walls of my carefully constructed life felt as though they were closing in, each brick laid by expectation, each mortar mixed with duty. But the wild, free call of Samuel's music was a hammer against them, demanding release. The rift was no longer a subtle crack, it was a gaping chasm. The air in the Ellison drawing room, usually still and heavy with Lily of the Valley, crackled with an unspoken tension. Julian Vance, his impeccable composure only barely concealing a steely resolve, stood before Viola, holding her fate in his manicured hands. He presented his ultimatum not as a demand, but as a reasoned choice, a necessary sacrifice for the greater good. "Viola," he began, his voice measured, "our engagement, our future, it signifies more than just two individuals. It is a symbol. These bohemian interests you've cultivated, they are distracting. They invite speculation, They undermine the very principles we represent. You must sever these ties, return to the path we have charted, or our engagement, regrettably, is at an end. He framed it as a choice for the movement, for her family's legacy, for a world where their influence could truly make a difference. But to Viola, it was a choice between her life and her soul. Overwhelmed, a knot of desperation tightening in her chest, Viola sought out Samuel. She found him in his small, cluttered apartment above the jazz club, sanctuary filled with the scent of old books, lingering incense and the ghosts of countless melodies. The city hummed faintly outside, a distant, indifferent murmur, but inside the world shrank to just them. The saxophone, his silent confidant, rested on a nearby chair. Tears welled in her eyes as she confessed the immense pressure she was under, the impossible choice she faced, the weight of her family, the expectations of her community, Julian's unwavering certainty. It all pressed down on her, threatening to suffocate the burgeoning, fragile truth she had found with Samuel. Samuel listened, his dark eyes understanding, his face etched with a quiet empathy. He offered her no easy answers, no false promises of a world where their love would be readily accepted. Instead, he offered something far more profound, unwavering support, a silent strength that promised to bear witness to her struggle, whatever her decision. He picked up his saxophone, the gleaming brass warm against his fingers. He played for her, just for her, a slow, bluesy melody that was both a lament and a promise. It spoke of his heart, of their connection, and the fierce, unyielding freedom she yearned for. The notes hung in the air, a shimmering tapestry of raw emotion, a silent plea for her soul to choose its own song. The vibrating hum of the saxophone reed resonated through her, a visceral confirmation of a truth she could no longer deny. The scent of old vinyl records and Samuel's unique, musky scent filled her senses, anchoring her to this moment, to him. As the music swelled a tide of raw emotion, Viola, drawn by its magnetic pull, moved closer, her hand tentatively reaching for his. Their eyes met, a silent understanding passing between them. This was not merely physical longing, but a yearning for true emotional resonance, a recognition of kindred spirits. He set his saxophone gently on the nearby chair, the sudden silence of the apartment after the music a profound punctuation mark. He pulled her into his embrace, his arms strong and protective. Their kiss was deep, searching, a release of all the unspoken words and forbidden desires that had simmered between them for weeks. His hands cupped her face, then traced the line of her neck, sending shivers through her. She responded with equal fervour, her fingers tangling in his dark, expressive hair, her body pressing closer, hungry for the warmth of him. They sank onto the worn velvet couch, the music still echoing in their minds, a private symphony of their burgeoning love. Clothes fell away, not in haste, but with a deliberate reverent slowness. Each unfastened button, a testament to their growing intimacy, to the sacred trust they were building. Skin met skin, warm and eager, a revelation in the dim light of the apartment. His touch was tender yet assured, exploring her with a profound gentleness that spoke of awe and deep affection. He kissed her collarbone, the delicate curve of her shoulder, then trailed kisses down her body, eliciting soft moans that she couldn't suppress. Viola arched into him, a silent plea, her body singing with a desire she had never known. Her own hands explored the planes of his back, the tautness of his muscles, reveling in the tactile connection. When their bodies finally joined, it was a symphony of sighs and whispers, a meeting of souls as much as flesh, a culmination of all the longing and unspoken promises. He held her close, their bodies pressed together in a rhythm that felt both timeless and new, as if their hearts were composing a private melody of trust and longing. Her fingers dug into his shoulders, her head thrown back, lost in the exquisite sensations, in the sheer undeniable rightness of it all. It was a moment of profound emotional closeness, a quiet triumph of their shared vulnerability and burgeoning love wrapped in the warmth of mutual desire. When they gazed at each other, their eyes reflected not just passion, but a deep, soul-stirring satisfaction, the quiet triumph of finally belonging. A vibrant, hopeful dawn broke over Chicago, casting long, golden fingers across the city skyline. It was a new beginning, a poignant and deeply satisfying one, imbued with a sense of hard-won peace and authentic joy. Viola, standing before Julian Vance in her drawing room, felt the last vestiges of her old life crumbling, not with regret, but with a profound sense of liberation. The conversation was difficult, perhaps the hardest she had ever initiated, but the words flowed with a clarity she had never possessed before. She articulated her need for an authentic life, for a love that resonated with her deepest self, rather than one prescribed by expectation. Julian, though hurt, eventually accepted her decision with a stoic dignity that was characteristic of him, acknowledging perhaps that some melodies simply weren't meant to intertwine. Freed from the gilded cage of her past, Viola began to explore her own musical voice. Her classical training, once a rigid framework, now served as a foundation for a new, expansive expression. She experimented with improvisation, weaving the intricate structures of her youth with the emotional depth and raw spontaneity of jazz. She composed not for an audience of critics or society matrons, but for herself, for Samuel, for the burgeoning artist within. Perhaps she played in small, intimate venues, or perhaps her compositions simply filled the shared spaces of her new life with Samuel, each note a testament to her blossoming identity. Viola and Samuel, now open about their relationship, faced the societal repercussions with a quiet fortitude. Whispers turned to overt judgments, polite smiles hardened into disapproving stares. Yet they found strength and solace in each other, their love a powerful shield against the conventions they defied. They built a life together, challenging the norms not with defiance, but with the quiet power of their unwavering connection. Their home became a vibrant hub of creativity, filled with books, instruments, and the easy comfort of a shared life. The harmonious blend of piano and saxophone music, often flowing freely through their rooms, became the soundtrack of their existence. Years later, the evening light streamed through the window of their shared home, painting the room in hues of amber and rose. Viola sat at the piano, her fingers dancing across the keys, playing a soft, intricate melody, a new composition, born of both classical discipline and jazz improvisation. It was her own song, a testament to the journey she had undertaken. Samuel entered, drawn by the music, a silent smile playing on his lips. He approached her, his footsteps hushed, and placed his hands on her shoulders, then around her waist, resting his chin gently on her head. She leaned back into his embrace, her fingers still dancing on the keys, the comforting weight of his hand in hers a palpable presence. He kissed the curve of her neck, a tender, possessive gesture, a sounded acknowledgement of the life they had built. They didn't need words. Their connection was a palpable presence, a profound and enduring harmony. He whispered a soft compliment about her music, about her, a quiet reverence in his voice. She turned on the piano bench, their bodies aligning naturally, and they shared a slow, deep kiss. It was a kiss filled with the warmth of enduring love, quiet passion, and the profound peace of knowing they belonged together. Two different chords that had found their perfect unconventional song. The sight of a blossoming spring flower pushing through concrete, a metaphor for their unlikely love, came to mind. Some songs are written in a lifetime of carefully placed notes, others are improvised in the space between heartbeats. But the truest melodies are those we discover when we dare to play a different chord. velvet and glass. The suite at the Hotel Plaza Athénée was less a room and more a statement. It was a space designed to intimidate, with ceilings that soared to heights that made a man feel insignificant, and windows that framed a cool, indifferent Paris. The city, laid out like a map of jewels below, seemed to hold its breath. It was from this vantage point that Adrien Moreau conducted his life, a life of strategic acquisitions and calculated risks, where even beauty was a commodity to be leveraged. He stood by the window, not admiring the view, but assessing it, his reflection a sharp, tailored silhouette against the twilight. There was a tension in his shoulders that even the finest Italian wool could not conceal. He was a man accustomed to control, and the evening's arrangements had been disrupted. His usual companion for these public affairs, a woman as polished and predictable as the marble under his feet, had cancelled. An inconvenience, a logistical problem to be solved with the swift application of money. He had contacted the agency, a discreet service that catered to men of his calibre, and they had assured him of a replacement. The transaction was clean, efficient, and devoid of the messy complications of human connection. That was how Adrien preferred it. A soft chime at the door announced her arrival. He turned, his expression neutral, ready to deliver the same concise briefing he always did. But the woman who entered was not what he had expected. She was not a flicker of temporary glamour, but a stillness, a self-possession that was both startling and profound. Her name was Camille Durand, and she carried herself with the innate grace of forgotten royalty. Her dress, a simple column of dark velvet, did not shout for attention, yet it commanded it. It was her eyes, however, that held him. They were the colour of the Parisian sky just before dawn, a soft grey that seemed to hold the city's secrets. "Monsieur Moreau," she said, her voice a low melody that seemed to absorb the room's sterile opulence. "Mademoiselle Durand," he replied, the name feeling foreign on his tongue. "Your file was concise. I trust you understand the level of discretion this week requires." A small enigmatic smile touched her lips. "Discretion, Monsieur Moreau, is its own kind of art. It is like knowing the precise moment a piece of glass is ready to be shaped, and when it will shatter from the slightest pressure." The analogy was unexpected, poetic. It hung in the air between them, a strange and beautiful object. Adrien, a man who dealt in the hard currency of facts and figures, found himself at a loss. He had thought of her as an asset, a beautiful, polished line item on the week's balance sheet. Nothing more. But her words, her presence suggested a depth he had not accounted for. The corporate dinner was a battlefield of pleasantries, a place where smiles were sharpened and reputations were won and lost between the soup and the dessert. Adrien was prepared to guide her, to steer her through the treacherous currents of conversation. He was ready for the vacant nods, the feigned interest, the small social stumbles of a woman out of her depth. He was wrong. Camille moved through the evening with an effortless intelligence that was both a shield and a revelation. She listened more than she spoke, her perceptive gaze seeming to peel back the layers of carefully constructed artifice around them. She engaged the crusty old banker to their right on the nuances of 18th century architecture, her knowledge so precise and her passion so genuine that the old man was utterly charmed. She parried the flirtatious advances of a young tech billionaire with a wit as sharp and clean as a shard of ice. She was a perfect shield, deflecting the unwanted and drawing in the useful. Yet, Adrien felt strangely exposed. He was accustomed to being the most observant person in the room, but tonight he felt seen. He watched her across the table, the candlelight catching the planes of her face. She raised her wineglass to her lips, and the clink of crystal against crystal was a sharp musical note in the din of conversation. It was an ironic echo of her earlier words, a sound that seemed to hint at a hidden life, a world of fragility and fire. The scent of his own cologne, a fragrance he had chosen for its cold, authoritative scent, suddenly felt lacking, a hollow imitation of power. Beneath his feet, the polished marble floors of the restaurant felt as cold and unyielding as the life he had built for himself. Later, as they were driven back to the hotel in the silent cocoon of his limousine, he found himself studying her profile against the passing city lights. She was looking out the window, her expression unreadable. "You handled yourself well tonight," he said, the words feeling inadequate. She turned to him, her grey eyes holding his. "It was a performance," she said, not with cynicism but with a simple statement of fact. "We all have our roles to play, Monsieur Moreau." "And what is your role, Mademoiselle Durand?" he asked, the question more personal than he had intended. She smiled that same enigmatic smile. "Tonight, I was the velvet glove on your iron fist, a soft shape to distract from the hard reality of business." He had hired her to be a beautiful distraction, a temporary solution to a logistical problem. But as he looked at her now, he realised that she was not a distraction at all. She was a presence, a mystery that had unsettled the careful balance of his world. For the first time in a very long time, Adrien Moreau was intrigued. And for a man like Adrien, intrigue was a dangerous and seductive proposition. The days that followed unfolded like a series of quiet revelations. The sterile elegance of the hotel suite and the sharp-edged world of corporate dinners gave way to a more intimate Paris, a city steeped in soul and shadow. It was a Paris Adrien had forgotten existed, a city he had long since dismissed as irrelevant to his ambitions. Camille, it seemed, was reintroducing him to his own city, and in doing so she was slowly, imperceptibly reintroducing him to himself. Their first stop was the Musée Rodin, a place Adrien had not visited since a school trip decades ago. He had remembered it as a dusty collection of statues, but with Camille, it became a sanctuary of captured passion. She moved through the gardens with a quiet reverence, her gaze lingering on the taut muscles of a bronze figure, the desperate embrace of two lovers carved from unyielding marble. "He didn't sculpt stone," she said, her voice barely a whisper, as they stood before the kiss. "He sculpted the air between them. The longing, the space that is about to be filled." Adrien found himself silenced by her words. He was a man who understood value, who could put a price on anything. But as he listened to Camille speak of art, of the tension in the marble and the passion captured in bronze, he realised that he had no currency for this kind of understanding. He saw not an escort, but a scholar, an artist. He saw a woman who understood the language of beauty in a way he never had. Later that afternoon, he found her on a small private balcony of the hotel, away from the sterile perfection of the suite. She was sketching in a small worn charcoal sketchbook, her brow furrowed in concentration. It was an unguarded moment, a glimpse behind the flawless facade she presented to the world. He felt like an intruder on something sacred. "What are you drawing?" he asked softly, not wanting to startle her. She didn't look up, her fingers continuing to move across the page with a practiced grace. "The way the light remembers the stone," she said simply. He looked out at the rooftops of Paris, at the play of late afternoon sun on the ancient buildings. He had always seen the city as a collection of assets, a portfolio of real estate. But through her eyes, it became something more, something alive. He saw the history in the stones, the stories the light told as it moved across the city. He saw poetry. That evening, a sudden downpour trapped them in the car on their way to another business dinner. The rain fell in sheets, blurring the city lights and creating a cocoon of quiet intimacy. The rhythmic drumming on the roof was the only sound between them. The pretense of their arrangement, the careful distance Adrien had maintained, seemed to dissolve in the rain-streaked darkness. He found himself speaking of things he had never shared with anyone, not even his closest confidants. He spoke of a past business partner, a man he had once considered a friend who had betrayed him in a way that had left him emotionally bankrupt. The betrayal had been a brutal lesson, one that had taught him to trust only in assets, not in people. It was the moment he had begun to build the fortress around his heart. Camille listened, her silence more comforting than any words of sympathy he had ever received. She did not offer platitudes or easy reassurances. She simply listened, her gaze steady and compassionate. In her eyes, he did not see judgment or pity. He saw understanding. "You speak in riddles, Camille," he said, a note of frustration in his voice as he tried to break through her elegant deflections. "In poetry." She looked out at the rain-streaked window, at the city that was both their prison and their sanctuary. "And you, monsieur, speak only in contracts," she replied softly. "Perhaps we are both translating a language the other has forgotten." The words struck him with the force of a revelation. He looked at her, at the woman who wore couture-like armour, but whose eyes held the sadness of a forgotten history. He realised that he didn't want their arrangement to end. He wanted more time to unravel the mystery of Camille Durand. "I need you for the rest of the week," he said, the excuse of business sounding flimsy even to his own ears. "There are other engagements." She turned to him, a faint smile on her lips. She knew, he realised. She knew that this was no longer about business. It was about something else entirely, something that was both terrifying and exhilarating. As she reached out to steady herself as the car turned a corner, her hand brushed against his arm. The touch was fleeting, but the warmth of her skin, the surprising connection in that simple gesture sent a jolt through him. It was a warmth that he had not realised he had been so desperately missing. The gritty texture of charcoal dust on her fingertips, the rhythmic drumming of the rain, the surprising warmth of her hand. These were the sensory anchors of a deepening connection, a connection that was slowly, surely, breaking down the walls he had so carefully constructed. He was a man who had built his empire on the bedrock of control, but with Camille, he was beginning to understand the beautiful, terrifying power of surrender. The Palais Garnier was a cavern of glittering opulence, a place where dreams were spun from gold leaf and velvet. The annual charity gala was the pinnacle of the Parisian social season, a breathtaking spectacle of wealth and power. But beneath the surface of its beauty, the air was charged with a stormy Bronte-esque tension. Every smile was a calculation, every whisper a potential weapon. It was into this gilded arena that Adrian and Camille made their entrance. And they were the centre of attention, not just for Adrian's formidable reputation, but for the woman on his arm. Camille was a vision in a gown the colour of a midnight sky, a stark, elegant contrast to the frothy confections worn by the other women. She moved with a liquid grace, her head held high, her enigmatic smile a perfect shield against the prying eyes of the city's elite. For the first time, Adrian felt an undeniable, unprofessional pride. The way she held herself, the way she looked at him when he leaned in to whisper an observation in her ear, it felt real. He allowed himself, for a fleeting, dangerous moment, to believe that it was. They were a portrait of perfect harmony, a couple so exquisitely matched that they seemed to cast the rest of the room in shadow. They danced, a slow, graceful waltz that felt less like a performance and more like a private conversation. In the circle of his arms, with the music swelling around them, the world outside their embrace seemed to melt away. There was only the scent of her perfume, the warmth of her hand in his, the startling intimacy of her gaze. But the real world, with its sharp edges and cruel realities, was waiting for them just beyond the dance floor. It arrived in the form of Antoine Dubois, a man Adrian had bested in a recent business deal, a man known for his casual cruelty. He cornered them near the grand staircase, his smile a predatory slash in his handsome face. "Moreau," he said, his voice dripping with a venom that was barely disguised by the veneer of politeness, "I must commend your taste. You always did have an eye for unique acquisitions." Adrian's hand tightened on Camille's arm. He knew this man. knew the kind of damage he was capable of inflicting. "Dubois," he said, his voice cold. "I wasn't aware they allowed vultures in here." Dubois' eyes flickered to Camille, a malicious glint in their depths. He recognized her. "Ah, but this is a special occasion," he said, his voice rising, drawing the attention of those around them. "A reunion of sorts. I was just admiring your companion. She looks remarkably well, considering." He paused, savouring the moment, the growing circle of curious faces. "You always did have an eye for damaged goods, Moreau. This one shattered quite spectacularly a few years back, didn't you, chérie?" The words, spoken with such casual cruelty, landed with devastating precision. The glittering society folk who had been admiring Camille moments before now turned their gazes on her with a new predatory curiosity. Their admiration was replaced by a mixture of pity and contempt, the two emotions she had spent years trying to escape. Adrian felt Camille flinch, a barely perceptible tremor that ran through her body. He wanted to shield her, to pull her away from the poisoned glare of the crowd, but it was too late. The unmasking was complete. Dubois, revelling in his victory, delivered the final fatal blow. "Camille," he announced, his voice echoing in the sudden silence, "the celebrated glass artist. Or should I say, the formerly celebrated one. The one whose grand commission for the Beaumont Foundation, the Icarus installation, shattered so spectacularly. A tragic story of ambition and betrayal. She trusted her partner, you see, poured her soul into his designs, only for him to claim them as his own when the glass proved too fragile for her. Artistic temperament." He let the lie hang in the air, a perfectly crafted piece of poison. Her partner soared, and she, like Icarus, fell, a fall from grace that was almost biblical. He smiled at Camille, a smile that was all teeth. "Tell me, my dear, have you managed to pick up the pieces, or are you still selling them off one by one?" The sound of a champagne flute accidentally dropped, shattered, on the marble floor. The sharp, splintering sound a perfect echo of the devastation in Camille's eyes. The vast, echoing space of the opera house, which had felt so magical moments before, now felt cold and predatory. The blinding flash of a photographer's camera caught the single tear that escaped her eye, a diamond of grief on her perfect porcelain skin. She turned to Adrian, her face a mask of profound heartbreak. "Now," she whispered, her voice choked with a pain that seemed to tear through him. "Now you see the glass beneath the velvet." And then she was gone, a fleeting shadow in a midnight gown fleeing into the prison night, leaving him frozen amidst the wreckage of their beautiful, fragile illusion. The hours that followed were a blur of cold silence and sharp-edged regret. Adrian's hotel suite, once a symbol of his power and control, now felt like a gilded cage. The panoramic views of Paris, the city lights twinkling like a million indifferent stars, offered no comfort. He ignored the incessant buzz of his phone, the dozens of calls from his peers, his PR team, the vultures of the media who were already circling, eager to feast on the carcass of a good scandal. For the first time in his life, Adrian Moreau had no strategy, no plan. He had only a hollow ache in his chest and the echo of Camille's whispered words. "Now you see the glass beneath the velvet." He had seen it. He had seen the raw, fragile truth she had kept hidden, and he had done nothing. He had stood frozen as the world he had invited her into had torn her apart. Sleep was impossible. The image of her face, the profound heartbreak in her eyes, was burned into his memory. As dawn broke, casting a pale grey light over the city, a decision settled in his heart. A decision that had nothing to do with damage control or strategic retreats. He used his formidable resources, the same resources he had used to build his empire, not to spin the story, not to protect his reputation, but to find her. He found her in Montmartre, a world away from the opulent heart of Paris. Her loft was in a quiet, cobbled street, a place that felt more like a sanctuary than a home. He stood before the door, his heart pounding a nervous rhythm against his ribs. He had faced down corporate raiders and hostile boardrooms with less trepidation. When she opened the door, he was confronted with a woman he had never seen before. Her composure was gone, shattered like the champagne flute at the gala. Her hair was unbound, a dark cloud around her shoulders. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed and filled with a fragile fury. She wore a simple, paint-splattered tunic, and her hands, the hands that had so delicately held a wineglass, were calloused and capable. The loft was a space that was more soul than room. It was filled with the ambient heat of a furnace, the earthy scent of wax and charcoal. And everywhere there was glass. Breathtaking sculptures, some twisted in pain, others soaring with light. It was the diary of her hidden years, a testament to her resilience, her pain, her extraordinary talent. He finally understood. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice raw, devoid of the melody he remembered. He didn't offer excuses. He didn't try to explain the world he lived in, the cruel games that were played. He simply looked at her, at the woman who'd been so brutally exposed, and he spoke the truth. "I'm sorry," he said, the words feeling inadequate, yet they were all he had. "I'm sorry for my ignorance, for my world, for not seeing you sooner." He took a hesitant step into the room, his gaze sweeping over the incredible sculptures that filled the space. "I don't care about the scandal, Camille. I care about you." Her anger, the fragile shield she had erected against him, seemed to melt away, replaced by a wave of heartbroken tears. A sob, a sound of grief and relief broke from her, and she collapsed against him. He caught her, holding her, just holding her, his arms a circle of solid, unwavering support. He let her feel his presence, a silent promise that he would not let her fall. The embrace deepened, a silent language of comfort and contrition. He reached up, his hand gently cupping her face, his thumb brushing away a tear that traced a path through the charcoal dust on her cheek. The gesture, so tender, so reverent, seemed to undo her completely. He kissed her then, not with the frantic passion of a man seeking to possess, but with the profound recognition of a man who had found something precious. It was a kiss that spoke of absolution, of acceptance. It was like he was breathing her in, learning the shape of her spirit, the texture of her soul. His hands moved from her face to her back, tracing the delicate line of her spine, feeling the shivers his touch created. Clothes, the velvet armour and the tailored wool became barriers to this overwhelming need for closeness. They were shed not with haste, but with a tender deliberateness, a shedding of the final facades. Skin met skin, a silent communion in the warm, dusty air of the studio. The silent, beautiful glass sculptures around them glinted in the low light, refracting the dawn into 1,000 tiny rainbows on their skin. They were witnesses to this quiet, sacred moment. When their bodies pressed together, it was fire and fragility all at once, a dance of need and tenderness, where every sigh seemed to carry a lifetime of unspoken longing, and every touch was a silent vow. "I see you. You're safe here." The intense residual heat from the glass furnace filled the room, a tangible reminder of the fire that had forged her, the fire that was now finally warming him. In the profound silence of the loft, broken only by their breathing, Adrien Moreau, the man who had built his life on the cold, hard currency of control, finally learned the redemptive power of surrender. The quiet, hopeful light of dawn filtered through the large, dusty windows of Camille's loft, turning the floating motes of dust into dancing diamonds. Adrien woke slowly, the scent of charcoal and brewing coffee mingling in the air. He was entangled in the soft, worn sheets of Camille's modest bed, her head resting on his chest, her breathing a soft, steady rhythm against his skin. The world outside, with its demands and judgments, its sharp-edged society and its relentless media, felt a universe away. He watched her sleep, the fierce artist at peace, the lines of tension around her eyes softened, her lips curved in a faint, serene smile. In the soft morning light, he saw not the disgraced artist, not the polished companion, but the woman in all her resilient, breathtaking beauty. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he could not return to his old life. He could not go back to a world of sterile sweets and transactional relationships. He had found something real, something true, and he would not let it go. Later, after a breakfast of strong coffee and croissants from the local boulangerie, he watched her work. He stood in the corner of her studio, a silent observer, as she moved with a focused grace, her body a fluid extension of her art. She gathered molten glass from the furnace, the glory hole as she called it, a glowing incandescent ball of liquid fire. She rolled it, shaped it, her breath a steady creative force as she blew life into the formless mass. He saw the strength in her arms, the passion in her eyes, the sheer unadulterated joy she took in the act of creation. He had spent his life acquiring things, beautiful things, expensive things, but he had never witnessed the birth of beauty itself. He had seen her pain in the twisted, shattered pieces she had shown him, but now he was seeing her hope in the new fluid shapes she was creating, and he knew what he had to do. He picked up his phone, but he didn't call his lawyers or his PR team. He called Genevieve Valois, the most influential gallery owner in Europe, a woman known for her discerning eye and her disdain for the predictable. She was a woman who understood that the most compelling art often came from the most compelling stories. "Genevieve," he said, his voice firm, resolute, "have something for you, something extraordinary." A week later, Camille's studio was transformed. The organised chaos was still there, the scent of wax and charcoal still hung in the air, but now it was a curated space, the breathtaking sculptures illuminated by carefully placed lights. Adrian had not moved her art to a sterile white gallery. He had brought the art world to her. He had framed her not as a scandal, but as a brilliant artist who had returned from the wilderness, her story not a source of shame, but the very fire that had forged her unique and resilient talent. The private viewing was a quiet affair, a gathering of the city's most discerning collectors and critics. They walked through the studio, their voices hushed with awe, their gazes lingering on the sculptures that told the story of her fall and her rise. Antoine Dubois' Poison had been transformed into a powerful narrative of resilience and redemption. As the last guest departed, leaving behind a trail of hushed promises and future exhibitions, Camille turned to Adrian, her eyes shining with a light that had nothing to do with the gallery lights. "You did this," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We did this," he corrected her gently. "You created the beauty. I just opened the door." She was working on a new piece, something fluid and hopeful, a swirl of blues and greens that seemed to capture the colour of the sea and the sky. Adrian stood beside her, handing her tools, an observer who'd become a participant. At a crucial moment, as she held the blowing rod, the molten glass glowing at its end, she took his hand and placed it over hers. "Feel that," she murmured, her voice a low vibration against his skin. "That's the moment of creation, the moment it can become anything." He felt the heat, the delicate balance of pressure and breath, the life force of the molten glass. It was a metaphor for their future, a collaboration, a careful shaping of something beautiful and new from the broken pieces of their pasts. She turned to him, her face illuminated by the fiery glow of the furnace. He leaned in and kissed her, a gentle, loving kiss that tasted of coffee and charcoal and the sweet promise of a new beginning. It was a kiss that was not about fire, but about warmth. It was not about passion, but about peace. It was a physical affirmation of their new, unbreakable bond. In the heart of Paris, a city of stone and light, they had discovered that the most beautiful things are not built, but forged in fire, from broken pieces, made whole again by the art of love. The velvet had been stripped away, revealing the glass beneath, not shattered and broken, but resilient, radiant, and more beautiful than he could have ever imagined.